Good morning once again. So glad to see all of you here this morning. I was especially touched when someone I haven't seen for a while came into church this morning. Pat, it's wonderful to have you here this morning. So the other day I had attended a workshop outside of Chattanooga, and someone started asking me, as people do at these kind of things, what do you do for a living? I said I was the minister of a small church, a small but growing church, I think. What type of church is it, they asked. And then, I don't know if this happens to you, if you ever talk about Pilgrim, but they said, what type of church is it? And I said, this church, it's a UCC church. Well, what does that mean, UCC? United Church of Christ. Oh, Church of Christ, I get it. No, I said, it's quite different from the Church of Christ. It's very much on the liberal, progressive side theologically. So this person asked, is it like the Unitarians? Well, in some ways, but we specifically follow Jesus. Hey, you're welcome to visit. It's a small congregation, but it's very loving, open-minded people. At this point, I'm hoping that I really won't have to explain anything else about what I do or what kind of church I'm the minister of. But there's one last question they usually ask. So what is the name of the church? Pilgrim. Pilgrim Congregational Church. Well, I received the comment, that's a funny name for a progressive, open-minded church. And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't, and maybe it's just the right name for us. Will you pray with me, please? Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Throughout New England, and I would say throughout the country, some of you have come from California and other places afar, UCC churches often do have this name, either Pilgrim or Plymouth. And this harkens back to our separatist and Puritan roots. Well, Puritan doesn't sound very progressive, and I understand why this is quite confusing for people. But if you think about it, these are folks who ventured across the Atlantic at a time when that was a pretty rough and dangerous voyage, believing that perhaps if they came to a new place, farther away from the King of England, they would have a chance to organize communities of faith with some freedom. And as different as we are from the early Congregationalists, one thing we have in common with them is that in our church, the people create the church. We don't have bishops, we don't have a hierarchy. No one tells us what to believe or even how to be together in community. And this lack of regulation or rules gives us a lot of freedom as a worshiping community. And it gives us a lot of space. We have space to create the form of worship we would like. We are a community of people who might be like-minded, but really don't all think alike. And we are able to create worship that is meaningful to us without anyone from a sort of central authority telling us that it must be done in a certain way. And I think most of you know this about the Congregational Church. For some of us, this kind of freedom might feel a little unsettling, and for others of us, it feels dynamic, like God is still speaking, and we can trust that God's presence is with us. And that's really what God was trying to impart to David. My presence is with you. It has always been with you. Today's Hebrew scripture reading describes David's concern that God does not have a permanent home. I mentioned that I was an architect to the kids. I was an architect, I still am an architect. But when I was a kid, I used to talk to my brothers and sister and say, how do you want your house to be? And then I would take graph paper and I would draw and design for each one of them their dream house. And I think David has this architectural intention for God. They have arrived in Jerusalem, as we talked about last week, a big arrival with singing and dancing. And now David realizes, I have a nice place to live, but God, symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant, is still dwelling in a tent. Having slept in a tent just recently, as in last week at the Wild Goose Festival, I can attest that a cedar house sounds a lot better than a tent. And David, rightly so, is wondering why he should be in comfort when God's presence is roughing it. So Nathan in the story is David's trusted advisor and a priest. And it is to Nathan that God speaks. And God wonders aloud, why are you all fussing so much about me being in a tent? When have I ever asked for a house? I'm happy in a tent. The tent is the very symbol of movability, of freedom and flexibility. And the wonderful thing about camping is how you realize how little you actually do need. A tent is sufficient, and you can pitch it almost anywhere. Although I would not recommend a sloped site with a tree root under you and ants building their home just where the tent had been pitched. And I'm not saying that's from personal experience, but realizing that even when we are in a tent, wherever we go, God is with us. Now, there is a type of massage called cranial sacral. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It doesn't involve vigorous stroking or pressure or didn't really much touch at all. The massage therapist facilitates the client's body, mind, and spirit to find something called the still point. The still point that brings us to internal quiet and a deep sense of inner peace. Cranial sacral therapists explain that when a client who either spontaneously drops into a still point or responds to a still point from the therapist does this, there is a sense that you're sharing a sacred space together. And the sacred space allows one's inherent healing capacities to grow. And the sacred space generates deeper states of self-knowing, understanding, and acceptance. The sacred space is healing. Now, this kind of massage sounds really nice if you can get it, but I believe that we each have a still point inside of us that we can find. It is the God within us. And this sacred space goes with us wherever we go. And this still point is something we can share in a way that is healing to those around us when we can access the still point within us. The 13th century poet Rumi once said, "Remember, the entrance door to the sanctuary is inside of you. The still point is within." Now, I'm not saying it's easy to go around feeling like you're at a still point at all times, or even maybe if you have that once in your week, that might be like a really great thing, because it's not easy. And we all need a reminder from time to time that this still point is within us. And David needs this reminder from God. God assures David, "I have been with you since you were a shepherd boy. I have been with you every moment. Wherever you go, I am with you. You don't need to build a temple for me, The nature of God is to dwell with us, to dwell amongst us and within us. And although we're going to get to this later in the summer, David's son Solomon will build a temple. And I think that's very interesting as well, because we human beings seem to need our buildings. That's not something that God asked for. God's Spirit moves freely and cannot be contained in structures made by human hands. So why, you may ask, if you've been following along, do we have this church? Which is a building which I treasure. Why don't we just each access God's Spirit individually and not come to church at all? Why do we get together for worship? I don't know about you, I've never liked the word worship, and I always have to go back to try to understand what does that really mean. The term worship comes from Old English, and it means giving something its worth, like shipping the worth to something. In this case, it's giving God God's worth. So I guess that impulse in David was really appropriate. David wanted to give God God's worth by building a house. And we want to give God due reverence, to prioritize God in our lives. And coming together in community is one way to do this. The best kind of worship creates a place where we feel transformed, where we encounter the word in sacrament, at church, in new ways that fill us up and send us out into the world to do God's work of compassion, justice, and holiness, to hold that holy space for others. And it is in these sorts of communities that God pitches God's tent, where God brings God's presence. Not so much to the buildings themselves, but to the relationships, to the places of love and siblinghood that we create. Paul reminds the Ephesians that the church is built on the cornerstone of Jesus Christ. In him, the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God. I love that. We are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God. That's what worship is. And it could take place anywhere, even this tent, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in Jesus' name. So getting back to this question of whether pilgrim, it's hard to say pilgrim in this town, because isn't there like a chicken factory named Pilgrim? Yeah, okay. Getting back to the question, is pilgrim a good name for our church, this spiritual dwelling place for God? We have to remember, I think, sometimes that the name pilgrim did not originate with those who crossed the Atlantic in the 17th century seeking religious freedom. A pilgrim, this concept of pilgrim, has always been one who wanders and travels seeking religious transformation. And this definition of what it means to be a pilgrim speaks to me today about this congregation. We are people on a journey. We are not those who arrive at the destination and then close the doors behind us, build a fortress, and settle in. Not at all. We are those who remain open to a still point within us and a still speaking God. We hope to stretch our cords and strengthen our tent stakes to draw the curtains wider and enlarge the tent to include more and more people of diverse points of view. We seek to love one another where we are without seeking to change each other or convince each other of anything. We venture out as pilgrims in this world, bringing the good news of God's love for all to a hurting, tired, and divided world. You all You all gathered here today, you are the living sanctuary for Christ to dwell. And we do this when we create space in our hearts for one another, when we forgive often, when we laugh, when we sing, when we dance together. We are creating beloved community. This is preaching, not with words, but with our very lives. As St. Francis of Assisi was said to remark, always preach the gospel. If necessary, use words. So how are you preaching the gospel with your life? How can you join in proclaiming peace to those who are far off and peace to those who are near? God reminds us to find that sanctuary within, to live from that sanctuary, and to invite all those we meet to dwell in that sanctuary with us.